All right. Well, welcome y'all to the final round of the, what is this, the Box Elder Annual Boogie Revival. Congrats to all you guys for participating and hopefully learning, most importantly. And congrats to the finalists for making it here, and hopefully we can have a quality round. It's on you. So I guess should we introduce the panel quick?
Sure.
So we have Mark, Sarah, Becca, not you're Sarah, I knew that. Becca, Tori, Andy, Steve. I'm Emilio. Yeah, should be good. Cheer when appropriate. Yeah. So without further ado, I guess we should have the Prime Minister begin the case for the government side. Here, here. Here, here.
Oh, I need such control of the camera for once.
5 minute speech is correct.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Honorable Speaker, we believe that the threat of nuclear war is a tyranny over the global population, a flaming sword ready to fall upon our heads moments after launch. We believe that every nuclear weapon in the U.S. hands should be disposed of in a safe and environmentally friendly manner. And ultimately, we believe that what is going to win this round is who provides for the most survival of the human race and stability. And what we'd like to bring you today is a principle of why we must get rid of these weapons, why the time is now, and finally, why it must be all at once. So as to the principle, we think that a nuclear war means the death of civilization as we know it, widespread nuclear winter, and we believe that by removing half the nuclear weapons, we increase the odds of the survival of human civilization. Think of Australia as less Mad Max and more sanctuary. So ultimately, we think even by doing this, we increase the well-being of the human race, regardless of what the other nations do. Now, why is the time now? So we think that it is not a matter of when, or not a matter of if, but rather when. And for this, we point to the policy of the U.S. first strike. We believe that in a perfectly rational choice, eventually, at some point, one of the nuclear powers is going to get backed into a corner, at which point a perfectly rational decision to use nuclear weapons will take place in order to ensure the survival of the state. As preemptive nuclear war is believed to be winnable by a certain fringe of academia, and we believe that in such a situation, as backed into a corner, their voices will be the loudest, thus making nuclear war an eventuality. Thus, every year we wait is a tick off the talk of closer to death for the entire human population. Thus, why must it be this way? Why must we get rid of all of our nukes now, and why will Russia and China not strike us when we're down? So we ultimately think that if we don't get rid of them all at once, we reach a point where nuclear war is winnable, where the enemy has the capability of taking out our nukes before they reach us because the numbers are so small that the systems that can take them out have a high probability of success. Thus opening us up to a strike, because we doubt that the global powers will believe that we are actually giving up our nukes. However, if we preempt this by getting rid of all of our nukes at once, we can avoid tempting others into nuclear war as we dispose of our nukes. And ultimately, we think that the population of Russia and China is just as abhorrent of the idea of annihilating another population in nuclear war as we do. If you need any evidence of this, perhaps that they're even more, look at the fact that both Russia and China have no first-use policies. So thus we think that in the end, the reason why this isn't a death blow to the United States is because of the vast amount of soft power we're going to accrue by acting in this manner. Because we believe that the rest of the world is not going to stand idly by if Russia and China, nor do we believe that their populations will ascend to the massacre of the entire U.S. population. Indeed, what we believe is that we are putting down the gun first. I'll take you real quick.
Okay. Do you really believe that the Russian population is the one who gets to make the decisions, or the irrational actor Vladimir Putin?
We don't think Vladimir Putin is an irrational actor. We think he has shown a lot of reasoning in his situations as he geopolitically maneuvers his country into success. Ultimately, we think that in this case, what we have is three actors who are all aiming guns at each other. If anybody wants to get out of this situation alive, someone has to put down the gun first. No other actor can put their gun down until one person does. Now, this choice is a hard choice. It is not a choice that the others are likely willing to make on their own. That is why we must be brave and take this risk in order that we may ensure the survival of human civilization as we know it, and ultimately create a world that is not under the unstable threat of nuclear warfare if someone were backed far enough into a corner, but rather a world that is not on the brink of destruction. What we ultimately think we do here is by putting down our nuclear gun, we make it possible for Russia and China to do the same. We say that, hey, look, the reason that you would maintain this expensive and risky nuclear force is because we have ours too. Thus, when we get rid of ours, we make it possible for a safer world.
Hear, hear. I want to thank that speaker for their remarks and introduce the leader of opposition to begin the case for the opposition side. The man with 3 watches. Show him.
Wow.
The government side wishes to not only invite in the agent of chaos, but to let them stay for dinner. We of the opposition ultimately believe that by introducing this policy of immediate nuclear non-proliferation in exclusively the United States, that we ultimately believe this will completely destroy the stability of our entire system as we know it. So before we get into some new matter, I'd like to first start out with some rebuttal. Essentially, they've claimed that if the United States will get rid of its nuclear weapons, that other countries will either follow suit or won't nuclearly first strike, and also that it sets a soft power standard. I'd like to point out 2 flaws with this. The first is that the U.S. is actually the country with the most effective policy of nuclear armament. Essentially, we've had lots of years of historical precedent set whereby we've effectively maintained not using nuclear weapons. Essentially, by maintaining this long Cold War standing, we've learned the correct politics to use nuclear weapons, and actually we should be more worried about the less stable actors, the new nuclear powers and the rogue states that are more likely to maintain nuclear weapons that we need to be able to react against first. Secondly, we also need to ultimately concern ourselves, yes.
Okay, we understand that this entire idea that we need to nuke the rest of the world totally disregards the immorality of using radiation as a means of warfare.
Ultimately, that's not what I'm arguing for at all. In fact, I do agree with non-proliferation. However, I believe that how the resolution is phrased with immediate destruction of all nuclear weapons from the United States is inherently what is the issue with this resolution. So moving on to my own points. We ultimately need to recognize that the opening government has correctly identified what the major value is in today's debate. It is to maintain a stable world, whereby diplomacy is possible and whereby we are able to maintain peace. But the issue here is that they have inherently created the least stable situation possible. And I'll get into this through a few points. Firstly is the historical precedent set by nuclear weapons. Since World War II, nuclear weapons have been the status quo of major world power diplomacy throughout the world. What we ultimately need to recognize here is that by removing nuclear weapons, we ultimately remove what has been the major system of operation in this modus operandi for every nation that has diplomatically interacted for the past 50 years. We need to recognize that Cold War politics was founded on nuclear weapons, that our Chinese and North Korean politics have been founded on nuclear weapons, that our politics with most of the nations have been founded on nuclear weapons. The removal of this inherently changes the diplomatic situation between all countries relative to the entire world and to the United States. Because the U.S. is such a major actor, and because the U.S. is so reliant on nuclear weapons to maintain their power, ultimately what we're doing is creating a power vacuum, which I'll get into through my next point, is that there will be a major shift in player politics if we were to immediately remove nuclear weapons. By making sure that the United States is exclusively the one major power that doesn't have any nuclear weapons at all, we inherently remove our ability to defend ourselves in the case of an immediate first threat. What we're ultimately doing here is removing the idea of mutually assured destruction. The removal of this idea creates a system whereby there is chaos. When we have enemies across the world who have nuclear weapons, like recent states of North Korea, there becomes no disincentive for them to not nuke, or there becomes no reason for them to not nuke us. when we have no way of retaliating. Sure, we can put boots on the ground, but that's not really going to do that much when they can decimate cities at a push of a finger. Ultimately, we need to make sure that we have the capability to respond in kind. It's what our power is predicated on. It is the ability to maintain stability in our nation. While we ideally want a world whereby this is not the case, the goal is not to immediately remove it. You're inherently going against the stability of the entire diplomatic sphere by the removal of nuclear weapons at this immediate juncture and altogether. Yeah.
Okay, the underlying assumption that the only way for states to interact is through mutually assured destruction. They reference the Cold War, but we see that the Cold War ended, aggression ended without that assured destruction. Conflicts don't have to start that
But
way.
I would argue if Russia never had nuclear weapons, it certainly wouldn't have ended that way. If Russia had invaded Afghanistan and the US was the only nuclear power, what would have really happened? I think we would have seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki V2 if we had actually seen what this would have been like. What we ultimately need to recognize here is that while mutually assured destruction is not the ideal situation by any means, it is ultimately the only situation that is present at the current time. We need to take actual resolute steps to changes, and that can only be founded on a world where we have stability predicated by this assumption. Every nation has inherently operated under this system since World War II. We need to ultimately take that into account. We need to continue stability politics in order to actually maintain a better and more peaceful world. The way to see resolute change is not through immediate and severe action, but is instead through strategic steps taken to ultimately create progress through the system through actual diplomatic talks that my partner will get into when he talks about essentially how we can resolve this situation without this drastic and chaotic action. Thank you.
I want to thank that speaker for their remark and introduce the Deputy Prime Minister and continue the case for the government side. Hear, hear.
Considering this is a debate about stability, we actually think mutually assured destruction is inherently unstable. We're essentially trying to balance a pin on its head and hope it doesn't tip one way or the other and hope one country doesn't think taking the first strike will be the first move. If you don't believe me and think that by Parker's analysis, just look at the Bay of Pigs. You're 15 minutes away from complete nuclear annihilation with Russia, all simply because we staked our idea on all because we staked our stability on the idea that they wouldn't strike first. Now, I don't want to be 15 minutes away from a nuclear winter. I don't think any of us do. And I think the only way to prevent this situation permanently and holistically is for the United States, the largest nuclear power in the world, to completely and holistically get rid of its nuclear supply. But first, before I get into my new point about how this will establish a new world order that isn't based on imperialism, let's get at some old matter. Parker gets up here and tells you we're unstable. Well, I already talked to you in my intro about how mutually assured destruction is unstable. But furthermore, we think that we're going to be able to create a new international stability through economic dependence. We think China, one of the three big nuclear actors in this picture, is hugely economic dependent on us. So it wouldn't suit them to actually take the first strike at us. We think Russia has a lot of reasons not to take the first strike as well, because if they did, they'd be at odds with China and the rest of Europe too, essentially ensuring their destruction. So we think we're actually able to create stability in this system, but without the threat of annihilation, which we think is pretty cool. So now let's get into our new point about imperialism. Historically speaking, the Cold War era that Parker likes to talk about a lot, that we have used nukes to twist the arms of smaller nations. What does this look like? Well, in the Cold War, it looked like us going into predominantly communist countries to either overthrow their government or bully them a little bit, simply for our own benefit and to set up advantageous trade deals where we can exploit their working class. This is an evil in itself because A, we're just willing to allow economic exploitation just by the sheer virtue of us having more power, which we don't think is a moral way to have an international system. But furthermore, it creates instability too, right? Because the only way smaller countries feel like they can survive is if they can acquire other nuclear weapons. Take North Korea, for example. They are under constant threat from United States Western imperialism. And, at South Korea, at their border, we have a long history there. North Korea recently acquired a nuke, and actually due to the incentives that we have placed upon them. Because if they didn't acquire one, their destruction would have been all but guaranteed. And then they also have to rely on China, another nuclear power, to protect them with their nuclear umbrella. So we think that this system actually leads to small-scale proliferation. Before I go on?
Your example of North Korea is exactly proving why the U.S. is such a stable actor with nukes. MacArthur proposed nuking the North Korean border during the war, but we didn't do it because we responsibly used our nuclear weapons.
He proposed nuking the nuclear border, a high-ranking general proposed to. Furthermore, we don't think North Korea is especially stable. If you're using them as the paradigmatic example of why nuclear war will never happen, you need to look beyond Kim Jong-un. So, why is it bad that these smaller nations feel incentivized to get nukes? Well, take the analysis my partner Jonathan gives you, right? In a small-scale nuclear wars where there's 2 or 3 nukes being used at a time, nuclear war becomes winnable due to countermeasures that can take out 1 or 2 nukes at a time. This means the nuclear calculus becomes, instead of, oh, we can just get the first strike, or like we'll both die, mutually assured destruction falls apart because 2 or 3 nukes will not completely eradicate your society, albeit it does make a substantial first strike. But this means, due to the This means, due to the winnability of this nuclear war, that we think it's actually plausible for these nuclear powers to use them going into the future. And what's really going to spur them into using it is the fact that the United States is knocking at the door with constant hegemony, ready to pounce on them at the nearest opportunity that they show weakness. We think the only way to undo this power dynamic where we set up a nuclear war that is not only evident but winnable is to completely get rid of our nuclear supply. Why? Because now we're no longer just knocking on our door with the United States hegemony anymore. We're like putting the gun down and allowing them to develop freely. This means that smaller countries can feel at ease. They feel like they don't have to rely on nuclear weapons anymore to create stability because there will be no threat of annihilation if they put the guns down. You also think this marks a shift towards away from power dynamics as the governing principle of international relations to more a liberalistic account of international relations where we use economic benefits and whatnot and trade to guarantee international stability and the mutual prosperity of each country. But insofar as we rely on the double-edged blade that is nuclear weapons, there can never be true peace in the world. We're constantly on the edge of the next nuclear weapon. We're one miscommunication away from another nuclear strike. There have been earthquakes that have gone off as like nuclear weapon tests or registered that. It's easy to miscommunicate. The threat of nuclear war is real. The only way to avoid it is to end it holistically by eradicating every nuke ever in American spoilers. Thank you.
Sweet. I want to thank that speaker for their remarks and introduce the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here, here.
Okay, so what we can see from this debate at hand, from the top half of the government side, that they are providing an irrational motive of ending the nuclear threats that are currently plaguing our societies in the world today. As members of the opposition side, we will be providing new alternatives and rational methods for ending the plague of destruction of nuclear war that's currently happening in our society. Now, before I go into my 3 pieces of new matter, I first want to cover some pieces of old matter that was brought up by the top opposition side, or by the government side. So first, the top half of the government side brought up by getting rid of all nukes by the United States and decommission what we have right now, that this will prevent war. This is absolutely not true. This is an irrational method of getting rid of nukes and preventing war. By getting rid of the United States' nukes and trying to prevent war, this in turn will lead other nations who are irrational rulers, like North Korea that we've seen many countless times, who have performed many countless tests. This, as a result, North Korea will see this and will see that this is a new, unique opportunity for us. As a small country without any other alternative, they will see this as an opportunity for them to strike back against the United States, who they are, I don't know why they're mad at, it doesn't really make any sense. And they will make their threats that they've been making over the past 2 years, they will make those threats reality. They will execute those threats and will declare war on the United States and nuke other conglomerates of the United States like Guam and Puerto Rico and some of the states, and they have nuclear capabilities to reach the states. And by getting rid of these nukes, we cannot survive as a society, and we cannot survive as the United States as a whole. Before I move on to my 2 new points, I will ask a question from the bottom half of the government.
Okay, we understand that the U.S. still has the capabilities through Japan, through South Korea, through our military, to entirely annihilate North Korea regardless. What we simply do is we give the rhetoric and the moving forward saying that nukes are not okay.
I have to disagree with that. Nukes, since we are the United States, we are the most powerful country in the world. We have the highest GDP and the most spending on our military, and we have the most technologically advanced military in the world. If we get rid of those nukes that are a big part of our military arsenal, we are essentially giving away our military to another country who can take advantage of us because we will have no defense against these other countries that are threatening us, like North Korea and like other irrational rulers that are on North Korea's side. Thank you for that POI. Now I'm going to be moving on to my 3 points of new matter. First, I'm going to discuss how the current nuclear power is stable and reasonable. So as Parker defined in the status quo, that the current world as we know it is not creating massive amounts of nukes currently. We would like to point out that the nuclear production has plateaued. We have reached a point where we are not producing nukes, and other countries like Russia, China, and South Korea, and the United States are not producing nukes. They're mainly maintaining what we currently have. So I want to bring up the example that Parker touched briefly about the Cold War. So with the Cold War, nuclear creation was at an all-time high, and we were creating nukes massively because we were unsure of the predictability of other countries, especially seen in Russia and Cuba. We created nukes because we felt insecure, and if we get those nukes taken away from us, currently, right now in the status quo, we will not survive as a country. We are giving away our military, we are giving away our nukes, and we are giving away what we are protecting our country with. So as I mentioned in the Cold War example, we as the opposition do agree with nuclear non-proliferation, but we think that decommissioning our entire nuclear arsenal as just the United States will cause the United States to be, as a world power not having nukes, and as a world power being weak, spineless, and not willing to act on matters that currently come up, especially right now in the world what we see with North Korea. Second point, stability in the world can lead to progress. In the world, in this world that we have today, there are over 200 countries in this world who are participating in diplomatic agreements and negotiations. And as a result, this has led to stability, which has led to progress in the end. And taking away our nuclear arsenal will prevent the United States from participating in those agreements, in those negotiations, and in those progressing movements forward. Stability is what the top half of the opposition want to see in this round at hand, which we can see already that's been talked about quite a bit. By not having these crazy shifts in the world powers, we can better predict the next moves of the nations. I want to bring up the quick example of the stock market. So with the stock market, if the stock market is predictable and people can make predictable movements in the stock market, they will put their money in. They will put their money in because they'll get a good return. But if the current stock market is volatile and it's unpredictable, we're going to take our money out. This is a good example of what we can see in our stability. If the stability is predictable, we will be good and we'll be progressive. But if it's unstable, we are unsure and we'll jack up the nuclear creation rates, therefore bringing the world into a period of no progress. Now moving to my third and final point, that not having major shifts in politics will create a safer world. As a result of not having major shifts, will allow the diplomatic channels to be open between the big nations of the world like Russia, China, South Korea, and the United States. Since nuclear weapon creation has a point to where plateau, we are not creating any nuclear weapons. There aren't any major shifts in power. By keeping the non-major shifts in power that we currently have at hand, we can progress as a society, and we can progress and be stable as a global power. By not having major shifts in channels, we'll be able to open up negotiation to further progress other nations like as Russia, China, and North South Korea. By keeping those channels open, we can progress as a society, and this is why we are proud to oppose the resolution at hand. Thank you very much.
I want to thank that speaker for their remarks. And introduce the member of government to start off the back half of the debate. Here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This attack on my life has left me scarred and deformed. I forgot about the camera. I should have said
Have
that.
7 minutes on. I mean, geez.
Decommission all timers.
What's your name?
Tyler.
Thanks.
No problem.
What's your mother's maiden name?
What's your social security number?
I'll take autographs afterwards, guys. Don't worry about that. I think there are two main assumptions that need to be deconstructed from the opening case that really kind of underline their entire argument.
First off, the assumption that mutual destruction is the only way that states interact. We think that states can cooperate. We think that their primary example of the Cold War actually falls on our side, because we see that all that buildup, their understanding of buildup leads to war. We understand that, look, the Cold War kind of dissipated, right? We understand that, war didn't happen. You saw the cooperation of states in the making of a better world. We understand that you see that other cooperation, such as the UN, that actually continues, intergovernment organizations, that actually, inter-sovereign interaction that actually provide humanitarian aid. We have groups that allow us to not operate within this dichotomy. We understand in the same way we do not live in that world, and we think that de-escalating actually moves forward cooperation. Secondarily, we see that they said that we're losing our entire military. Let me just get rid of that real quick. First off, we understand that we still have a crap ton of bases all around the world with like the most expensive military in the whole world, right? Tons of soldiers, tons of tanks, everything. We don't lose that, right? We still have that clout, right? We understand that our external sovereignty still demands involvement. They said we're going to lose ability to talk. No. Anything military about Europe, anything about the Asia Pacific, anything about the Middle East, anything about Central America, right? We have military bases and we have to have conversations with the U.S. because we're already there. We're not losing relevancy since we lose one of our shining toys. We still have, a monopoly on everything else. Okay, secondarily, I want to go into this idea of framing what this debate is going into, because I think this is very important. Understanding that we have weapons capable of the same type of destruction minus the radiation. We have the Tears of Allah program. We have advanced laser weaponry, right? We have these ways of moving forward. We understand that we think we de-escalate, but if a war happens, we understand that we can still keep North Korea at bay, because they are still going to be absolutely annihilated in the case. But we think it's a moral imperative. Also, it de-escalates the conflict to get rid of the nukes, because we understand we mitigate the damage. My first point. We understand that radiation is a moral enemy, because we understand they have to come up here and say why radiation as a weapon of war is something that is necessary. We think that, one, it does indiscriminate killing, and they have to acknowledge that it is acceptable for the U.S. military to have a weapon that is totally fine with getting rid of civilians. Secondarily, one, it's a very slow death by radiation, right? It's very, very painful, and it has tons of different things, right? Your body is melting and breaking apart. You are losing the form of a human being, and we think that's morally despicable. We also understand the generational aspect. You're not only killing that people, but you are killing their children, their children's children. Anybody that moves there, you are impacting that world forever. We understand that you're killing the environment. If they're going to talk about, say, we need to be able to nuke North Korea, right? We destroy our allies in the meantime because the radiational clouds and the ash and debris that go into South Korea, China, and Japan essentially destroy our allies, and we do not think that is a moral good. We also understand that, no nuclear powers, 2 nuclear powers have gone to war. We understand that. We think that if that happens, survival of the species is on the line. We understand that there's a moral authority to say that if there is a war, we have to at least make sure that the species as a whole survives, because we think that is a moral good. Because having less radiation is a net good for the perfection of, or the continuation of the planet. Yes?
On your point about radiation being a moral bad, don't you agree that the horrificness of nuclear radiation is exactly why it's such an effective tool of diplomacy? Even if it's awful, it is the worst possible scenario, which is why you don't want to go to war with a country with nukes.
Okay, so if they're going to come up here and say it's more effective to threaten to skin somebody to keep them from actively doing a crime, I say that is morally terrible. There are alternative ways, right? We don't have to say we're going to melt your family and every ancestor or any of your children. We don't think that's an acceptable way moving forward.
Question?
Lastly, we understand that the power of rhetoric and why unilateral action is so important, right? Because we think the question is, how do we operate in a better world? We tell the world, being the unilateral actor, first, that it gives us the moral authority. The Western ethic will follow us. We understand because the U.S. essentially say that this is bad, we don't think we should go forward. We prove that we have the most power because we have the ability to say, no, it's not worth it, right? Or essentially we're saying, it's not that big of a deal anymore. We don't think it's important. We've moved on now. We've evolved. We find it's a moral enemy. But also it shames our enemies, right? Because North Korea has come up here. We understand that the entire conversation between North Korea is about, them saying, we want to be like the U.S. We want to be on the same side. So we're going to, put all our resources, starve our population in order to get nukes. And we're like, no longer important. We're getting rid of ours. And they're like, I don't know. We understand that they get validity by doing that, right? By using unilateral saying, we don't care about you. We don't care about our allies. We're just saying, they're no longer important. We devalue it, and we create a rhetoric that says that nukes are no longer important, and we push rhetoric away from the idea of aggression creates the foreign policy, and we say more of diplomacy. And we are willing to sacrifice for that in order to bring you to the table and say that the moral authority is no longer here. Thank you.
I want to thank that speaker and introduce the member of opposition to continue the case for the opposition side. Here.
We accept full-heartedly a moral obligation the closing government has put on us and show why the closing opposition is going to do the best job to long-term change in making a more moral society for the international community. Before I do so, I'd like to address that the top half did a great job of showing you the short-term analysis and the need for this mutually assured destruction and what that's going to guarantee us in the status quo. However, we're going to change the focus on looking what long-term change looks like and why this is going to allow for the United States to begin a discussion and change that will impact throughout the world. To frame this round, though, or to point a couple of pieces of refutation, I'd like to address the one very fallacious idea that Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons because he wants to be like the United States. The idea that Kim Jong-un follows the United States because he admires Donald Trump, who in a tweet this morning called him Rocket Man, is silly. We stand here in telling you that the international community and the geopolitical situation is framed by irrational actors who are at the head of governments. People like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin don't look at the United States and say, oh, what a good guy. The only way that we're going to be able to achieve diplomacy is looking through the international venues that have been provided for us, which leads me to my first point of new matter in the contextualization of the international community today. This week, the United Nations General Assembly has held a council with 122 nations on nuclear disarmament for the entire world. Every nuclear-armed country, as well as their closest allies, including the United States, refused to participate. To assume that the United States now can go to independent and unilateral disarmament and expect those people who refuse to participate in the council will just somehow follow suit all of a sudden is fallacious. We believe rather that the United Nations General Assembly and working with those other actors that also have nuclear weapons and the capability of creating this moral conflict will be the best way to increase long-term stability and change. Secondly, going along with this leadership analysis, we believe that the idea that the United States is, that other countries are just going to follow the United States because of their soft power or these other ideas is fallacious based on this idea and the evaluation of leadership politics.
Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin are both rational actors, because insofar as we're pointing our nuclear gun at them, they need nukes to avoid annihilation. How we make a rational decision, or rationally get them to get rid of their nukes, is to stop pointing the nuclear gun at them.
The fact that Kim Jong-un continues to fire nuclear weapons over Japan, I think, shows is a very clear demonstration that he is an irrational actor, despite threats from the international community, even if it's just sanctions. Furthermore, we believe that ally protection becomes an important part of the United States. But when they create this idea of the three actors pointing guns in the room, one is a little oversimplified, considering the fact there are more than a dozen nuclear-armed countries. Secondly, though, there are a lot of other countries standing behind the United States that have real positions that are important stakeholders in this resolution. To assume now that the Philippines, that Australia, that Indonesia are now all of a sudden just at the mercy of China, that the United States is not necessarily going to be, it has this diplomatic power that comes from a mutually assured decision, means that those countries are also left out to dry because they don't have access to that same forum that the United States does. So what do we achieve from keeping our nuclear weapons, at least for the short term? We believe that the best way to achieve long-term change is the international and multilateral work to disarmament through the United Nations or other organizations. This creates two inherent benefits. One, longer and more guaranteed that countries like China and Russia are going to be on board. Even if the United States disarms, if France and England have one side and Russia and China are on the other, this doesn't create this great world that the government side is trying to propose, that there's going to be no longer forms of mutually assured destruction of this East versus West ideology. Just because the United States bows out of the fight does not mean it doesn't exist. Rather, as we begin to work with the actors, like those the Perm 5, in order to work towards nuclear disarmament, then we begin to see a far safer world and a far more long-term, far-reaching stability. However, we hold one of the greatest impacts in today's round, and that is the fact that universal nuclear disarmament guarantees no new actors. New actors like North Korea and Iran, who pursue nuclear armament, are the greatest threat to international instability insofar that they do not play by the same rules as the rest of the international community. That while the United States, as opening government discusses, has long and tried traditions of what nuclear engagement looks like, those new actors don't. Those new actors represent the greatest threat to power-shifted politics, specifically with nuclear weapons that create a great threat to stability for the future. Nuclear disarmament at the universal level, where the United States participates with other countries, is key to that solution. If the United States puts down their gun, then they lose the opportunity to talk in a gunfight. Allow the United States that short-term accessibility, because that's how we achieve long-term change, and that's how we achieve that moral imperative that the government is so keen to achieve.
Here, here. I want to thank that speaker for their remarks and introduce the government whip to finish the case up as a whole. The obligatory Seattle flannel speaker.
Grunge is not dead. Grunge forever.
Cocaine lives on.
That's right. Decommission your Nirvana CDs.
By unilaterally denuclearizing the United States arsenal, we can lead the way to a safer and more peaceful world. Since we created nuclear weapons, we should be the ones to take the first step to disarm. This changes the world's rhetoric internationally. It creates a powerful statement that nuclear weapons are not only violent, but they are now obsolete and antiquated. I'll get more onto that topic later. Our top halves, the Prime Minister and his deputy, stated that nuclear war is a threat to society, and this is so true today. I would like to point towards the amount of horrors that come from radiation poisoning, from radiation fallout, whenever a nuclear bomb or nuclear missile is used. Radiation, as my partner was describing, it is indiscriminate. It does not matter where you fire the missile. Wind currents can make the nuclear radiation cloud go to any direction depending on wherever those wind currents are blowing. This means that wherever we fire that nuke, there is a high chance that there will be friendly fire towards our allies and maybe even attacking an enemy that we were not ready to engage. On top of this, it is environmentally destructive. So those of you who would want to preserve the environment, those of you who always fight for climate change, why would you support something that would be so destructive to the climate? Yes?
So if your only objection is that there is the potential that it can destroy the environment and cause these other harm, why don't we get rid of nuclear power too, for the small possibility that there's a meltdown?
I'll get to that point later. So, it doesn't matter whether nuclear war is inevitable or not, there's still the chance of it happening. So why take the chance? The opposition paints this picture of doom and loss of political power in the United States if we denuclearize. However, I would submit that this is a false narrative, and I will tell you why. The kind of world that they create is false, and actually creates the world that they are trying to get away from, and how the world that we create by denuclearizing creates a safer world and a more peaceful world. So, this first off, nuclear weaponry is antiquated. We know this because of the technology that we have. For instance, the opposition has stated that the U.S. is reliant on its nuclear power for its political power right now. This is truly not the case. We are so ingrained into the international economy that to attack us would destroy the economy of the entire world and put the entire world in a complete depression. We are the largest consumer of goods in the entire world. So any trade would be affected by us being taken out of the economy. Furthermore, North Korea, they say North Korea will be able to strike us without a nuclear arsenal. This is truly not the case. We have the technology to prevent this. So, for instance, we have missile defense systems that are incredibly advanced. Furthermore, we have weapons that can replace these nuclear technologies. As my partner has stated before, we have satellite weaponry, the Tears of Allah program. This is a steel rod the size of a telephone pole that can do the same amount of damage without the radiation fallout and the horrors of that. Laser technology has also come so far that we can actually point it at a platoon of troops and not kill them at all, but just make them ineffective because it creates just enough pain that it doesn't harm them, but enough pain that it completely distracts them from combat. And furthermore, we are continuing to develop AI and drones that can take the place of our own soldiers in combat, which is what nuclear weapons were originally designed to do in the first place. So by denuclearizing, we are removing the horrors of radiation and the potential of the horrors of a human being melted by radiation whenever a nuclear bomb goes off, and simply just replacing it with more conventional weapons that are less horrifying. We can increase the strength of our international position, both military and politically, while making the world a safer place through the removal of this horrible threat to society as a whole. For this reason, I am proud to support this motion.
Hear, hear. I'll take that speaker for their remarks and introduce the opposition whip to round out the debate as a whole. Here, here.
This debate has been about is stability. What we want in the world is stability and peace on a long-term scale. Now, the top half has talked about how nuclear disarmament will not cause any more stability in the short term. But what my partner has talked about in the long term is how we can see more stability, more ability to cause long-term disarmament in the international community if we stay armored now. Why now? So the question we need to ask in this speech is, what is the best way to create long-term stability? What is the best way to create this long-lasting peace within the international community? Now, the first thing that my partner talked about was the fact that we need allies. We need to keep our allies who are not in the nuclear armament system safe from those who are. We need to protect those who are the Philippines, Indonesia, subject from China. We need to realize that those who count on us for protection need that protection and count on us to support them with nuclear weapons, with bringing them to the table. Secondly, he talks about the fact that the international community is not relevant, is not willing to be open to this idea of nuclear disarmament at this moment. Recently, the UN Council showed that not a single nuclear power attended this council in order to have nuclear disarmament. This shows that the international community is not yet ready for this idea that nuclear disarmament just can become a thing. How is it that the opposition side believes that if we get rid of our nuclear weapons, everyone will follow suit? This is an irrational world in which does not exist. I will take Taffy.
The only reason every other nuclear power isn't willing to give up its weapons is because we refuse to. And so far as we're still pointing the gun at them, they're going to still want to point a gun at us. We must take the first step.
Yes, but the first step should not be giving away our only bargaining chip, giving away the greatest power that we hold. It needs to be the fact that we are willing to talk with other people and bring people into the discussion. Within bringing people to the international community into this discussion by saying, hey, look, we have the most nuclear weapons here. So what if we put some away, what if you put some away? And that is how we move to long-term solutions, long-term stability. It is not, oh, I'm going to get rid of all of my nuclear weapons and everyone's going to be like, oh, United States, yeah, popular, got to do that too. No, it's this idea that we need to realize that it is a long-term discussion, a long-term objective that cannot be created with a singular motion. Finally, we need to realize that multilateral nuclear disarmament can only happen if we have no new nuclear actors. We cannot allow the international community to accept new actors into the idea that they are allowed to have more nuclear weapons. If we get rid of our nuclear weapons now, that allows time for Syria, for different countries, to say, hey, maybe I want nuclear weapons as well. But if we do not allow, if we do not disarm, if we keep our nuclear weapons and bring into the discussion the fact that we need to, over long term, create nuclear disarmament, it allows us and the entire international community to say, hey, no, this is not okay. We have all agreed now that this is not okay. We have talked through it, we have opened a discussion, and we've decided that there will be no new actors with nuclear weapons, which will ultimately create this stability which we need within nuclear disarmament. Yes.
Okay, the Reddit creation remains the same as long as you live in a context of nuclear war. You get rid of that nuclear context, now you can speak from a moral authority and actually make change happen.
But how are you supposed to be able to do that if your people are not willing to listen to a leader who they deem as an irrational actor without that bargaining chip of nuclear weapons? People do not respect Donald Trump at this time. They will not allow him into the discussion without that bargaining chip of weapons, without that bargaining chip that we currently own. We need to realize that we cannot allow this to continue. We cannot allow nuclear weapons to continue in the community. We all agree that global stability is the overall objection, but it is a long-term objective. It cannot be solved with one short-term thing. It cannot be solved with a mean girl mentality that one ideal breaks all. And that is why we need no new actors. We need to bring in the international community to a dialogue, and we need to support our allies to create this long-term stability. Proud to oppose.
We're here. Good job, guys. Shake hands. Should we go outside?
Yeah, we can just go around the corner or something.
Yeah. Okay, let's go find one.